podcast where we talk to smart people, but not necessarily done by smart people?
That is an awesome question.
This one goes down probably on one of my top 5.
Hey, I like nutrition. I like to eat food.
This is the coolest thing ever. We're going to do this forever.
I wish I paid more attention in that class.
You know, I'm going to be honest, I don't understand that. As a man, I don't get it.
Welcome to smartpeoplepodcast.com.
Hello and welcome to Smart People Podcast, conversations that satisfy your curious mind. Chris Stem, thank you for tuning in. What do we have for you today? Today we're going to the weird, right? I thought it was nice to mix it up. We've had a lot of kind of business and formal and all that. Let's get back to our roots and learn about something weird, which is the heart. So this week on the show, we are talking to Bill Schutt. Bill is a professor of biology at LIU Post and a research associate at the American Museum of Natural History. His newest book is called Pump, A Natural History of the Heart. Just as interesting, his last book was called Cannibalism, A Perfectly Natural History. And that book blew up, and I think this one will too. So we wanted to have Bill on to talk about random stuff like how big is a blue whale's heart and why are horseshoe crabs critical to science and why are we essentially killing them for our benefit. We talk about bats. We talk about COVID. We talk about, did COVID come from bats or was it created in a lab? There's just all kind of cool things that come out of this. Happy to have Bill on the show. Remember, you can reach out to us at smartpeoplepodcast@gmail.com. Also, tell a friend if you like the show, if you like an episode, share it with them. And of course, you can support us at patreon.com/smartpeoplepodcast. All right, short and simple. Let's turn it over to Bill as we talk about the heart and weird things in the world. And we highlight his new book called Pump, A Natural History of the Heart. Enjoy. I got your book here in front of me. It's called Pump, A Natural History of the Heart. Your last book was about cannibalism. We were just talking about, gosh, that was 4 years or so ago, and you still are talking about it a lot. I wanted to start there with, you are a zoologist. So first, for the uninformed like myself who thinks zoology, all we know is it has something to do with animals. Tell us about that. What is it like? What is being a zoologist? And then how do you make the transition into writing about kind of random topics like the heart and cannibalism?
Yeah, I think I've been a zoologist since I was a little kid. I always studied animals. Back when I was a kid, you could have these exotic pets that thankfully you can't, by law, have them anymore. I mean, I had a monkey when I was a kid and boa constrictors and pythons. And so I was always looking under rocks and collecting animals. And my idol when I was a kid was Jacques Cousteau. I wanted to be a marine scientist. And so my first year and a half of college, I was a marine science major. And I just thought, that don't go so specific as an undergrad. And so I moved it over and spread it out so that I was studying, animals across the board. And that became a real interest of mine, especially vertebrates. And got my master's degree at SUNY Geneseo, studied squirrels and their ectoparasites. And then when I went to Cornell for my Ph.D., my mentor there got his grant money looking at muscle physiology. He worked at the vet school. Now, he was a zoologist. He was not a veterinarian. But his real love was studying bats. And so when I got accepted there, the question became, what was I going to study? Myosin isoforms in horse muscles. And this was, this was a big deal because this was the Cornell vet school. So when something went wrong with a horse that was worth $1 million, you brought him there and they did a biopsy and then they looked for problems. But it probably took me about 5 seconds to figure out that I wanted to work on bats. And so zoologists, we have carved out smaller areas of expertise. And so I decided among the 1,500 or 1,400 and change species of bats to study vampire bats. So that led me to write a lot of papers about vampire bats, which eventually led me to get an agent.
And that was the start of it. That was the start of it all?
Yeah, and from there it became what was going to go. How do you follow vampirism in the animal kingdom?
So I got to ask you, I mean, given you say bats, and I don't know what people thought of 20 years ago, but now I think of COVID. Have you thought a lot about that? Is that something you know a lot about, this idea of the transmission? Because look, I'm not going to go on conspiracy theorists, and this is
Sure.
a podcast meant for
Yeah.
intelligent people,
Yeah.
but I gotta say, the fact that it went from a bat to a wombat or whatever to a person is far less likely, in my opinion, that it was created in a lab and it just got out. I'm
Okay.
curious on your sense
No,
of
no,
that.
no. So it's so my son who studies viruses. I've asked them this question. So I said to him, "What do you think of this conspiracy theory?" And he said, "There's absolutely, absolutely zero proof, nothing. But there's every bit of proof that this is a type of virus that we know about for a long time, and that this specific type of it is." Viruses are readily transmitted between species. This happens all the time. And we think this is, for example, how AIDS was transmitted. And when you talk about viruses from swine flu, for example, that sort of thing.
Yep.
This happens all the time. What doesn't happen is a virus escapes from a laboratory. So if you're going to weaponize, and this is the other thing that I'd heard, was that if you were going to weaponize a virus, you wouldn't weaponize this respiratory virus. You would not do it because it is less apt to mutate than any number of other types of viruses that you would probably be better off if you were trying to develop a weapon. So his response, and this is, at this point, this is certainly what I support, is that there's no evidence whatsoever that this was man-made or that it escaped from a lab. It probably was transmitted at wet markets where they bring in animals from the woods or from wherever, and there's no sanitary conditions, and they're getting blood all over themselves. They're picking up other animals, and that is far more likely the mode by which COVID was transmitted, possibly from a bat to another a host, and then to humans. But
Yeah.
to me. And bats have they carry a lot of viruses anyway, and they're able to have what's known as a high viral load. They have a lot of they can have a lot of viral particles, virons, in their bodies, but not necessarily get sick because their immune systems are so jacked up. They and other animals can readily transmit these diseases to humans when the humans have this sort of unnatural contact with them. If you're collecting 1,000 bats, slaughtering them in the market with no sanitary conditions, then you're asking for trouble. And I think that's what happened in Wuhan.
Yeah, makes sense. Look, that's why we do this podcast. I follow the smart people and I follow the intelligence, and that's what everybody says. And so I believe that it just seems sketchy. But look, this is what I'm talking about. You have studied bats. Your son works with viruses. Like, that's about as close to an answer as we're going to get as I'm going to get. So I'll take it.
Yeah.
So I want to jump into the book all about the heart. Like you mentioned, it kind of goes through the animal kingdom, but there's another underlying theme. And this is where I want to start. When and why did the heart become, as you call it in the book, the center of the soul?
I think it was the ancient Egyptians. They did a tremendous amount of medicine. And one of the things that they did was, so they knew that living things moved, and that if you stimulated them in a certain way, you could get them to respond. And when they were looking at organs, they came to realize that the heart was the same thing. It moved, and that it would respond to stimulus if you scared someone, for example. And so they didn't really think much of the brain at all. And so what they did after their people died, they preserved the heart, or they kept it in. They either put it back into the body, or they put it into a jar, because in the afterlife this would be weighed against the feather of Mot, and Mot was sort of the goddess of a virtuous person, for example, like integrity, that sort of thing. So the heart had this supreme importance as the seat of what we might call the soul, intelligence, and emotion. And so the ancient Greeks, when they picked up on the Egyptian writings, they picked up a lot of Egyptian medicine. But they also picked up on this cardiocentric concept where the heart was responsible for emotions and intellect. And it was really the prime organ in the body. And when the Romans picked up on that, they ran with it. And so they kept this concept of cardiocentrism. why it remained sort of this emotional center was because of the artists and the poets and the dramatists who then picked up on this concept of cardiocentrism, and they ran with it, and they're still running with it. And so you got all of this terminology and all of these beliefs centered around how the heart is the center of strong emotion, whether it be hate or love, and the soul and all of these things. In the follow-up to this was that people like Galen got a lot about the heart wrong in his anatomical studies, and that just stayed around for 1,500 years for various, and really slowed down and put a halt to any kind of improvement in medicine for over 1,000 years. That to me was the damaging thing, not the fact that people still think of the heart as as the romantic seat of the body.
We actually do that for all types of different parts of our physiology. I was just listening to a thing about how at one point it was the stomach, and then it was the heart, and then much more recently it was the brain. Now it's going back to the stomach. Like, we constantly move around in this area.
At the same time, you had a surgeon like Galen, and he was doing medical studies and doing experiments. Unfortunately, the Romans were not allowed to do experiments, or they were not allowed to dissect the body. So they had to use animals. So they made their proclamations about how things work based on non-humans. They got a lot of it wrong. They didn't have the equipment. They certainly didn't have the capability that we have. They believed that there were these 4 substances that you had to keep in balance, the 4 humors. Everything was based on that, blood being one of them, which is why they bled people forever. What Galen did, I think, for his time was okay. But the problem is that Galen's works, and there was 3 million words that were recovered that he and his, I guess, followers probably had written. When they were translated, they weren't immediately translated into Latin. They were translated by 2 Syrian Christians, and these guys, when they did their translation, they put enough of a Christian slant on it that it worked for the church. And so the church accepted this translation of Galen's work as being divinely inspired. So therefore, nobody could do anything. And like I said, a tremendous amount of it was wrong. So that was perpetrated for 1,500 years. You had this, you had the Age of Enlightenment and all of these things taking place, and the Age of Discovery, not in the fields of medicine for the most part.
In your book, you cover a lot of different animals, the impact, the way the heart works. I'm curious, from your perspective, you went into this probably not knowing what to expect. You kind of mentioned that at the beginning of the interview. What was the most shocking thing or the most unexpected thing you came across?
So I work at the Museum of Natural History, and so I have friends that work at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, and they had been lucky enough several years ago. 9 blue whales died, and 3 of them washed up. And these were whales that not a lot was known about their anatomy because they have a tendency to sink when they die, which is why they were not popular for whalers, because they weren't the right whales. The right whales were the whales that didn't sink, that they could harpoon and then retrieve. Blue whales were fast and they sank. So they were sort of the wrong whales. So not a lot was known about their anatomy, but some of my friends, they'd been asked for years, what's the biggest heart in the world? And they'd respond, well, blue whale heart. How big is it? Probably the size of a sedan. Oh, all right. And at a certain point, and they get asked this over and over again, when these whales washed up, they decided to see if they could preserve this heart, to go get it. So that became this tremendous undertaking. It took 5 years. They went up there. They had to use big, all sorts of equipment. They had to get inside this thing. They had 4 people in there pushing it out between ribs. And they were surprised by many things. One of them was it didn't look like a human heart. It looked like the way it looked to me when I saw the pictures, it looked like a soup dumpling. So if you laid the thing down, it would collapse. And this may have something to do with the fact that these things dive so deeply that if you had a structure that was more solid, like our heart, you'd have problems with pressure. But if it could collapse under the increasing pressure, that could be an adaptation for deep diving. But the thing that really so they preserved this thing, and I tell this story about the 5-year process of of transporting it and then freezing it and then thawing it and then rinsing it and then plugging all of these vessels with various size, bottles of every size, and finally sending this thing to Germany, where this semi-crazed scientist had made a specialty out of plastinating living things. If you've ever seen the exhibits of humans and they're sort of frozen in position or they're dribbling a basketball,
Yeah.
this is the guy who did the work on the whale heart. But what was a real surprise when they finally got to look at this beautiful structure completed and display it, was how small it was compared to what they thought it would be. And so, they expected it to be, that this is the largest creature that ever lived on the planet, that the heart would be the same, would be the largest heart of all. But comparatively speaking, it's not. Yeah, it's a big heart. It's like 350, 400 pounds. But relatively speaking, it was small. So they downsized it. They didn't put a sedan in the display. They put like a smart car. That was probably the thing that surprised me the most. But there was, when you're dealing with, ice fish that have antifreeze in their veins, or boa constrictors that when they eat a meal, their heart grows 40% larger. It's difficult to pick out what was more intriguing to me.
The ice fish, though, tell us about the antifreeze and how is something like that discovered?
Yeah. Well, so the fish, I think, was discovered in the early 1900s by fishermen, but no one really looked at it until more recently. And when they started to get more better techniques with analysis of things like blood, they found out that there was a substance in this. They wondered, how could this fish exist in this frozen water of the Antarctic? And they found a substance that was an antifreeze. It raises the temperature at which the blood will freeze. So they found an antifreeze substance in this fish, and so people were asking, well, how could that evolve? How could this happen? And when they looked at it, they said, well, this was probably a mutation that occurred millions of years ago, because if you look at their blood, it's clear. How did that happen? Why don't they have, they don't have hemoglobin? What? How do they not have this oxygen carrying substance and survive? So one of the things that we think evolved was this antifreeze substance. And the other thing is that cold water holds more oxygen. So they were already in a place where there was more oxygen in their surroundings. They evolved, they have no scales. So they're able to get oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide, especially getting the oxygen through their skin. So, and they are,
Wow.
and they're not super active. They're sort of weight and pounce predators. So all of these things worked out in favor of this creature that you're like, how could it exist in this area where there's, where it's absolutely freezing and there's very few animals there?
Before we get into some more of the animals, I did want to ask, as you were going through this, really digging deep into the various animals, the differences, everything like you said, from this fish to blue whales, what did you find were some of the biggest differences with the human heart? Like how do we compare structurally, anatomically, adaptively to the rest? Did you see any themes there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a mammal heart. It's a 4-chambered heart. It's really a double pump. The right side of the heart pumps blood that's returning from the body, that's oxygen depleted, and has a lot of waste products that it's gotten from various organs that drain into small veins, that drain into larger veins, that drain into your vena cava that carries this blood back to the right side. So here's this O2 depleted, carbon dioxide filled, waste product filled blood. And the right ventricle then pumps that blood to the lungs, where it picks up oxygen. This has got this capillary system that surrounds the respiratory system at the level of the alveoli, the tiniest little bubbles at the end of your bronchial tree. And so this exchange takes place. The oxygen that you breathe in passes into the blood. The carbon dioxide in the blood passes into the alveoli, and then you breathe it out. Now, the same thing is taking place with waste products and nutrition when the blood passes through the digestive tract. So here comes this blood now back from the lungs to the left side of the heart. It's full of oxygen. It's got nutrients in it that it's picked up on its trek through the digestive tract. Left side pumps, sends the blood out to the body to supply the body. And it's interconnected. So now you get to a capillary bed eventually. blood gives up its nutrients, gives up its oxygen, picks up carbon dioxide, picks up waste, and then returns to the right side. So the whole thing starts again. It's really a double pump. A lot of animals don't necessarily need that. So we look at them and we go, well, look, these lizards have only 3 chambers. They've only got 1 ventricle, and there's some mixing of the deoxygenated and oxygenated blood. Oh my God, they must be primitive, or that's so inefficient. See, that's the wrong way to look at it. We look at our hearts and we go, this is the pinnacle, this is the best. Works great for us, right? Well, so does a 3-chambered heart work great for a lizard or an amphibian. And so does a 2-chambered heart work incredibly well for a fish. They're not overbuilt. It does the job that it evolved to do. So there are major differences between animal hearts. And certainly when you go to the invertebrates, then all bets are off. There's all sorts of stuff that evolved to circulate a fluid, to circulate and move nutrients around, or in some instances oxygen, sometimes not. But there's a lot of differences. You can't expect, though, to take an insect like a moth and blow it up to Mothra and have it exist, because the systems that it has in it are not going to be efficient enough for something that large. So that I was really depressed to find out that Mothra couldn't really live. But we need to really stop thinking about non-human organ systems as being somehow inferior. And it's, we've been doing that for a long, long time. When I was a kid, it was, whenever you saw Neanderthals, they were dragging their woman by the hair and they had a club and they were bent over. Now we realize they had a brain that was bigger than modern human brain. And that they were portrayed as being bent over because the first fossils that were put together had serious arthritis. And now we know that they were very, very different than that, and certainly not to be made fun of or, poked at or joked about. And it's like that with a lot of things.
It's funny you say now we know that. And one of the things I want you to know is now you know that, and some of us are learning it. Okay, like there you go. I just learned something else. I didn't know that about Neanderthals. Well, I guess that's what happens when you work at a museum.
Yeah, but also but you have people like Mary Roach and Bill Bryson who are out there educating. I don't care about jargon. I'm not trying to show off the fact that I know scientific terminology, and neither do these authors. We're trying to take sometimes complex issues and educate people while keeping it entertaining and telling stories that are maybe the more interesting story. And when you got somebody interested, then going off on a tangent and giving a lesson about something. For me, I could say the word diffusion as a process, and you might or might not know what I'm talking about. But when I say, if you could demonstrate diffusion by going to your hall closet, and if you've got a whole bunch of junk in there, if you poke little holes in the wall, some of it's going to come out, right? So it's going to follow the concentration gradient, just like if you have an alveolus at the end of your bronchial tree that has more carbon dioxide in it than there is in a tiny little vessel next to it, then it's going to move from a high concentration to a low concentration from the lung to the circulatory system. And it's the same, you're looking at a closet door with holes in it.
It's true. No, I was telling you before we started recording, those are some of my favorite books, some of my favorite authors. I just like the way it's written. You learn something at the end. I kind of view it as this podcast. I hope you get through, you enjoy it, you enjoy the conversation, and you walk out with some knowledge, some better understanding.
Yeah.
Last question, because I mentioned it a few times. What the theme that I noticed in your book is exactly what you were just talking about, which is, as we all know, we know evolution. We know what it is. We know why it happens. But it's like taking one of the most important components, right, the heart, and showing how in different animals it serves a similar purpose differently.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those that I've started to see how miraculous it is the horseshoe crab.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about the horseshoe crab and why we are really dangerous as it relates to the life of the horseshoe crab, but how it serves us so well.
Yeah, this was a fascinating story that I got my friend Leslie and I got to tell. But we started to do work on this topic, and that was the fact that there's a substance in horseshoe crab blood that has been determined to be extremely important. And the reason it is important is because there are little organelles inside, or cells inside the blood, that contain a substance that causes clots when it comes into contact with certain types of bacteria. And these are bacteria that fall under this heading of endotoxins. Endotoxins are produced when bacteria are destroyed. So if you were going to sterilize some equipment, surgical equipment, and it had bacteria on it, when you sterilize it and you burst apart that bacterial cell, it releases parts of the cell. And these are structural components. It's not like they're storing toxin to use against their enemies. These are parts of the cell, of the bacterial cell itself. And our body, when it comes into contact with these substances, treats it as a toxic substance and mounts a serious immune response against it. Now, someone figured out that if you take this substance that the horseshoe crabs have and you can make a test out of it, then you could see a specific chemical response visually occur if this substance came into contact with endotoxin. So you would test drugs, or you would test surgical equipment, or medical devices, or catheters. And so it became a real lifesaver. Now the problem is that horseshoe crabs have been around for 500 million years. You throw around the term living fossil. These are really living fossils. They've probably gone through the 5 major extinction events on this planet, and they're still around. And there are 4 different species, and 3 of them are endangered. But the one that we're using here is found on the west coast, on the east coast of the United States primarily. And this has now become a major industry, where where these animals are collected. And they're usually collected before they've mated and lay eggs. Toss them on the back of a boat, throw them in the back of a pickup truck, and there'll be hundreds of these things, thousands of them. Bring them to these facilities. They'll hang them upside down. They'll stick syringes into them to drain their blood. When it stops draining, they pull the syringe out. They put they by law have to put the horseshoe crab back where they got it from. Okay, well, maybe 30-40% of them die. When you put a horseshoe crab back that's had 30-40% of its blood drained, it's asking for trouble. It's not going to be in good shape. So this has really been problematic. And I don't want to say that they're not used for other purposes, and that's not putting a major dent in their population, because fishermen have found out they chop these up and put them in their traps, especially the big ones and the pregnant ones with the eggs, that they can use this as a bait to catch their eels and conches, which are big shelled animals. So they're in serious shape. So somebody came up with the neat idea of developing these tests without using actual horseshoe crab blood, without hanging these animals up. And this just started to take hold, and some major drug companies were starting to use it when COVID hit. Everything sort of got put on hold as these companies who needed this substance didn't want to be bothered with these new techniques. So they went back to what had been working for 30 years, maybe more.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so now it's problematic. But there are people out there who are really concerned about the conservation of these animals. And, to me, to be able to go in and meet these guys and get this whole story was pretty incredible.
As you say that, I'm realizing something that many people already know, but the importance of really understanding our surroundings. So, for example, when you were talking about studying 3 bats and dedicating a large portion of your time, energy, background to it, I'm going, well, what's the why? Not because it's not interesting. That's not what I mean. I find this stuff fascinating, but because of resource intensity. I mean, time is the only thing you have. It's spent researching bats. The thing, though, is the more of everything we understand its linkages. I use the analogy often of when we tried to go to the moon, we didn't realize it was kind of going to lead to the internet in one way. You know what I mean? There's just a lot of connectivity on this planet. And I think the horseshoe really exemplifies that.
Like I said, people who know me they're going to be laughing when you get to this and you're saying, because I've felt that way for so long, and maybe in a slightly different way, but that the connections, I mean, even if you look at the human body, and I taught human anatomy for 20 years, the exact wrong way to do this, to study for human anatomy, is to look at these systems respiratory system, circulatory system, nervous system. Look at them as different chapters. And that's the way the texts are set up that way. So I always tell my students, this is not a course or this is not a science where you can study the circulatory system and then you take the test and it's done. And then we'll move on to the respiratory system. It'll be something completely different because they are all intertwined. And there is this connection that is everywhere in the sciences and out there in the world. And for me, that's just one example. So I studied 3 species of vampire bats, but I was able to tell stories about that related to mammal evolution, to biomechanics, how anatomical structures work like machines, behavior, performance. All of these things aren't intuitive when you're saying he studied vampire bats for 30 years. But when you go in and look at the things that you can take apart, because maybe someone hasn't done that, or I've always talked about convergent evolution. Dolphins and sharks, same shape. They didn't come from a common ancestor. Why do they look like that? Because that works. You're going to be a fast predator.
And the other thing is, one of the best definitions of creativity and or innovation I've ever heard is taking disparate thoughts and using that knowledge to create something new, right? We interviewed the guy who wrote Range, Epstein, I think it was, and he talks about how when you're a generalist and you're accumulating various knowledge, different fields, you're practicing different things, it doesn't always look linear, but at the end, you oftentimes use those various experiences. Same thing. Seems like it's happened in your career and seems like it happens everywhere. So, Bill, I wanted to first say thank you so much. Again, the book is called Pump, A Natural History of the Heart. It is coming out like now. For those interested in this stuff, what I'd say is we scratch the surface. If you love the stories, the intrigue, the odd, it's full of it in this book. We will link to it as well. Is there anywhere else that people can find you, learn about you, see what you're up to as you keep writing these interesting things?
Yeah, BillSchutt.com is my website, but I also have a Facebook page, Bill Schutt Author, and I'm on Twitter as well, @BillSchuttBooks. So it's pretty easy to get a hold of me, and I love responding to people who have questions. I've done 3 TED Ed videos, 2 of them on cannibalism and 1 on how transfusions developed. You can look those up.
It's fantastic. It's also fascinating. Bill, I want to say again, thank you so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate it.
That was our interview with Bill Schutt. Hope you enjoyed. As a reminder, Bill's book, Pump, A Natural History of the Heart, can be found wherever books are sold. So let's jump into the housekeeping items real quick. If you'd ever like to reach out to the show, you can email us at smartpeoplepodcast@gmail.com or message us on Twitter @smartpeoplepod. If you enjoy the podcast, have been a long-time listener or even a short-time listener and want to help us out monetarily, you can do so by becoming a patron over at Patreon. So head over to patreon.com/smartpeoplepodcast. And if you want to stay up to date with all things Smart People Podcast, head over to the website, smartpeoplepodcast.com, and sign up for the newsletter. And of course, if you're looking for free and easy ways to support the show, just tell a friend or family member, or head over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcasts and leave us a rating or a review. All right, that's it for us this week. Make sure you stay tuned because we've got a lot of great interviews coming up, and we'll see you all next episode.